September 24, 1939, was a day of relentless suffering for the besieged city of Warsaw and marked a further deepening of the tragic fate of Poland under the dual occupations of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. As Warsaw faced its final days under constant bombardment and tightening encirclement, the grim reality of total occupation loomed ever closer. The day's events underscored the brutalities of totalitarian aggression, the strategic maneuvers of the occupying forces, and the increasingly urgent discussions among the Allied powers regarding how to respond to a rapidly deteriorating situation. Globally, there was a growing recognition of the dire consequences of appeasement and the urgent need for a reassessment of strategy in the face of the unfolding global conflict. The Siege of Warsaw, the last bastion of resistance. By September 24th, the situation in Warsaw had become almost unbearable. German forces had completely encircled the city, and the constant artillery and aerial bombardment had transformed much of the Polish capital into a landscape of destruction. The Luftwaffe continued its intensive bombing campaign, targeting both military positions and civilian infrastructure in an effort to break the remaining resistance and force a surrender. The humanitarian situation within Warsaw was catastrophic, with the city's population facing severe shortages of food, water, and medical supplies. Inside the city, the defenders, comprising the remnants of the Polish army, local militias, and civilian volunteers, were now fighting a battle of sheer survival. General Walerian Chuma, commanding the defense, and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, coordinating civilian efforts, faced the grim task of managing a dwindling defense with almost no resources left. Starzyński continued to broadcast over the radio, urging the city's inhabitants to stand firm, but the tone of his messages had shifted to a more somber reflection on the fate of Warsaw and the sacrifices of its people. On September 24th, the German forces escalated their efforts to bring about a swift end to the siege. Artillery barrages became even more frequent and intense, targeting any area of the city that showed signs of resistance or activity. The goal was clear: to force a rapid capitulation to avoid the costs and difficulties of a prolonged urban battle. Leaflets were once again dropped over the city, promising leniency to those who surrendered but threatening total destruction for those who continued to resist. Despite the unbearable conditions, the resolve of many in Warsaw remained unbroken. Reports from inside the city described a population that, despite facing imminent starvation and constant threat of death, refused to surrender to the invaders. The city's defenses were largely improvised at this point, with barricades made from rubble and every able-bodied person, regardless of age or gender, participating in the defense in some capacity. The Polish defenders knew that surrender would likely bring severe reprisals and that continued resistance, however futile, was a final act of defiance against their oppressors. Soviet consolidation in eastern Poland. A new order imposed. While Warsaw neared its breaking point, the Soviet Union continued to consolidate its control over eastern Poland. Following the Red Army's swift invasion and occupation beginning on September 17th, Soviet authorities moved quickly to dismantle existing political structures and impose Soviet governance. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, played a crucial role in enforcing Soviet rule, conducting widespread arrests and deportations to eliminate any potential resistance and to suppress nationalist sentiment. On September 24th, Soviet efforts to integrate eastern Poland into the Soviet state intensified. Local institutions were disbanded, and Soviet administrators took control, enforcing strict compliance with Soviet laws and policies. The Red Army's presence was heavily felt in cities and towns across the region, where it acted both as a deterrent against resistance and a symbol of Soviet power. The NKVD ramped up its operations, targeting anyone suspected of disloyalty or of holding onto Polish nationalist sentiments. The Soviet occupation was characterized by severe repression and the imposition of communist ideology. Schools were reorganized to teach Soviet propaganda, the Polish language was marginalized in favor of Russian, and religious institutions were targeted for closure or control. The collectivization of agriculture began in earnest, as Soviet authorities sought to break up traditional landholding patterns and integrate the local economy into the Soviet system. For the inhabitants of eastern Poland, the Soviet occupation brought a brutal end to their way of life, characterized by fear, repression, and the erasure of their cultural identity. German occupation. Further entrenchment and exploitation. In western Poland, the German occupation forces continued to establish and strengthen their control over the territories they had conquered. With the Polish military effectively neutralized, the Wehrmacht focused on consolidating its occupation, which involved a combination of military presence, administrative restructuring, and economic exploitation. On September 24th, German authorities intensified their efforts to pacify the occupied territories and prevent any form of organized resistance. Martial law remained in effect, and the Gestapo continued its campaign of arrests, targeting not only potential leaders of resistance but also anyone perceived as an intellectual or cultural threat to Nazi ideology. This systematic targeting was part of a broader strategy to suppress any form of Polish nationalism and to instill fear among the population. The economic exploitation of the occupied territories also intensified. The German occupation authorities imposed forced labor on the Polish population, with thousands being sent to work in German factories, farms, and other industries vital to the Nazi war effort. The policy of Germanization continued unabated, involving the displacement of Polish populations and the settlement of ethnic Germans in their place. This strategy aimed to create a loyal German population in the newly acquired territories and to erase Polish cultural and national identity. German propaganda continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary action to protect Germany from external threats and to secure its eastern borders. This narrative was designed to justify the harsh measures being implemented in the occupied territories and to maintain domestic support for the war effort. For the Polish population, the German occupation represented a period of intense suffering, marked by violence, coercion, and a systematic attempt to eradicate Polish identity. Allied response. Increasing pressure and strategic reassessment. As the fate of Warsaw and Poland became increasingly grim, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced mounting pressure to respond more decisively. The occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces highlighted the failures of Allied policy and raised urgent questions about the future course of the war. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government was under intense scrutiny for its handling of the crisis. Public opinion was increasingly critical of the government's perceived inaction and failure to support Poland adequately. On September 24th, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other threatened nations and expanding economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to constrain the British response. The Royal Air Force (RAF) remained focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also explored ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive even as Poland itself fell under occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared. But this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. The events of September 24th underscored the limitations of the Allied military and diplomatic strategies and the need for a more coordinated and decisive approach to countering the Axis and Soviet threats. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic recalculations. The continued occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces and the imminent fall of Warsaw prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 24th, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 24th, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Other neutral nations, such as Switzerland, Sweden, and the Netherlands, continued to bolster their defenses and prepare for potential spillover from the conflict. These countries, aware of their strategic positions and vulnerabilities, sought to maintain their neutrality while preparing for potential threats from both the Axis and Allied powers. The situation was particularly tense in Belgium and the Netherlands, where fears of German invasion prompted increased military readiness and diplomatic efforts to secure guarantees of neutrality. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 24th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the continued siege of Warsaw and the firm establishment of Soviet control in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 24, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the fall of Warsaw seemed imminent and the country was effectively divided between two totalitarian powers. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war.